The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. When Judas had left them, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and God will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little while longer. I give you a new commandment: love one another. As I have loved you, so you should love one another. This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of the Lord. The light turned yellow just in front of him. He did the right thing, stopping at the crosswalk, even though he could have beaten the red light by accelerating through the intersection. The woman tailgating behind him was furious and honked her horn repeatedly, screaming in frustration as she missed her chance to get through the intersection, dropping her cell phone and makeup. As she was still in mid-rant, she heard a tap on the window and looked up into the face of a very serious police officer. The officer ordered her to exit her car with her hands up. He took her to the police station where she was searched, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. After a couple of hours, a policeman approached the cell and opened the door. She was escorted back to the booking desk where the arresting officer was waiting with her personal effects. He said, "I'm very sorry for this mistake. You see, I pulled up behind your car while you were blowing your horn, flipping off the guy in front of you and cussing a blue streak at him. I noticed the 'What would Jesus do' bumper sticker, the Choose Life license plate holder, the Follow Me to Sunday School bumper sticker, and the chrome-plated Christian fish emblem on the trunk. So naturally, I assumed you had stolen the car." And that's why I never put a bumper sticker on the back of my truck. Never. Never. And that brings us to our gospel today. It's a passage found only in St. John. We have here John chapter 13, the Last Supper scene. It begins with Judas leaving the table to go do his dastardly deed. And then with the remaining apostles, Jesus gives them the most important commandment. In fact, he says, of everything that I've taught you, it's summed up into one: love one another. Now, just a couple chapters right after he said that, almost as though we didn't hear him the first time, he will repeat it again. He will say, "This commandment I leave you, love one another." But then he goes on in chapter 15 to define the type of love. He says there's no greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. For Jesus, true love, agapeia love as it's called in Greek, is unconditional, sacrificial, deliberate. It's a choice. And then he will conclude again by saying to the disciples, love one another. They will know you by the way you love one another. It's interesting that when you go to John's gospel, you'll find the word love used more than all the other gospel writers put together. And there's an important reason for that sociologically. John's community emerged towards the last of the first century AD, somewhere around 90 to 95 AD. The Lord had been risen from the dead now about 60 years. And it was a community of Jews who had converted to Christianity. They were all Jewish in their roots. They had a problem, however. They were surrounded by family members and friends who chose not to believe their story about this Jesus. They thought the whole idea of someone who had been brutally murdered on a cross, the cross was looked upon as a curse from God. How could you say that God would reward this person by raising them from the dead? And every Jew back then knew that the resurrection would occur, but it would happen at the end of time and everyone would be raised, not just one person. So their story was just bizarre. And so this little community didn't have to struggle with the Roman persecution. No, their problem was their families and friends who looked at them like a bunch of kooks or weirdos or the member of some strange cult. And so they felt totally isolated. They felt unloved by the world out there. And so they did exactly what Jesus had commanded. Love one another. They focused their lives on that concept. And then they would circle the wagon, so to speak. They would close ranks around themselves, and they would spend their time living the way of Jesus. And you know what? It worked. Because in a few years, not only would the community grow, they would take the Gentiles in time. And this community would spread. By the time the mid-2nd century comes about, they're now living in Rome. Love saved this community. It was the force that bound them together. And when they loved, they experienced the presence of the risen Lord. Love one another. We all know that we're supposed to do that as Christians. Jesus says, in fact, the only way the world's going to come to know me and to know who you are with regard to me is by your love for one another. But what about those unlovable people out there? How do you love someone who is unlovable? It's difficult to love some people, and you all know that. And by loving other people, Jesus didn't say we had to be doormats. There are people out there who have character defects. People who will harm you. They will hurt you. They will stick you in the back. They will do whatever they do. There's something wrong here. But we still are called to love. I remember when I was in the seminary, I was very fortunate to have an outstanding spiritual director. A spiritual director is kind of like a mentor that teaches you about spiritual things. I had a sister by the name of Mary Ann Huddleston. She was Immaculate Heart of Mary sister out of Dearborn, Michigan. She was a very intelligent woman. She had earned 2 PhDs, one in microbiology and one in psychology. And whenever she spoke, I listened. She never said a thing that was not well researched and well thought out. And so I remember one time in one of our sessions, we got together every 2 weeks. She brought up this whole idea of loving. She wanted to do a little analysis to see what my capacity to love other people might be, and which was a good thing to do if you're becoming a priest. And so she taught me something. She said, you know, Jim, there are in reality 3 levels of love. The deepest, the greatest, whatever you want to call it, the highest form, she called love of friendship. And she said people who say they have lots of friends make her nervous. And she said because if you're really loving at the deepest level, you can't handle more than a handful of these type of relationships because they take time. They take time. They evolve over time. But it's the kind of love where you just have a bond with someone that's almost mystical. Then the next level on the totem pole, she said, was what she called love of camaraderie. She said a lot of people share that kind of love. It's a love you have for somebody that you share a job together. You're co-firemen, or you're doctors on a medical staff, or you're teachers, or you may be 2 firemen that are on a bowling team together. You spend time together, you have common interest in those sort of things. Love of camaraderie, she called it. But, she said, the type of love that is required of all people who would call themselves disciples of the Lord is what she called gospel love. She said we have no options if we dare call ourselves disciples. It is sacrificial, it is unconditional, and it is a deliberate choice to to love another person. But still the question remained, and she did not give me an answer of how you're supposed to live this kind of gospel love. Well, I came up with my answer. And it was a little test that I put myself through. I tried to envision somebody that I really didn't care a whole lot about. And we all have those people. It may be a relative, it may be somebody with whom we work. They're just difficult people. They're tough people to get along with. And so what I did was, I looked at a gospel passage from Matthew 25. The gospel passage that Jesus says we are all going to be judged by on Judgment Day. Jesus says we're going to have to face the divine King, and he's going to ask us some piercing but very simple questions. When did you see me hungry and feed me? When did you see me thirsty and give me a drink? When did you see me naked and clothe me? When did you see me ill and take care of my needs? Or in other words, I imagine this person prayerfully with whom I have difficulty. And I ask myself, would I give them a cup of water if they were thirsty? Would I give them food if they needed to eat? And you know, when you think about it that way, most people would say, begrudgingly, but I would. Mom once said to me, son, you got to crawl before you walk. And what she meant by that was, sometimes with difficult things you have to take baby steps before you can do what you need to do. And so Jesus is not telling me to walk up to everybody and to slobber them with kisses and hugs. But I need to ask that question. Would I give them a cup of water if they were thirsty? That love that I thought I had for others got put to the test in a supreme way one time in 1983. I was halfway through the seminary and was stationed in a little tiny parish that no longer exists in the south side of Wheeling called St. Mary's. And I'll never forget, the diocese assigned me that summer for an entire year to serve as a chaplain at what was then called the Ohio County Jail. It was under the direction of the sheriff of Ohio County, a man by the name of Tom Campbell, who's now dead, unfortunately. And I'll never forget when I first showed up to work, I had no training in prison ministry. I did a little bit of research, but it's one of those on-the-job kind of things. So I walked into the front office of the place, and there sitting at the desk was Sheriff Campbell's brother, Bernie Campbell, who was the chief deputy. And he looked at me and he kind of chuckled and he said, well, Father, he said, I don't know why you're here. He said, because everybody has religion in this place already. And what he meant was, cynically, was there were more Bibles floating around inside that jail than you could shake a stick at. It seemed that everyone had religion. Well, then Bernie's nephew, a young man by the name of Tom, the sheriff's son, was the turnkey. And he took me around the various cell blocks to introduce me to the prisoners. And sure enough, these guys were quoting scriptures at me left and right, and they all had Bibles and all that kind of stuff. But it was basically a very cordial kind of experience, except for one cell. Inside that cell was a man who made me feel the presence of evil. He never spoke. He was a huge human being. He could have physically picked me up and snapped me in two. And I remember young Tommy telling me to keep at least 6 feet distance from his cell, to never get close to the bars, to never put my hand inside the bars, even if he were to ask me for anything. He said, this guy is really dangerous. His name was Calvin Clemens. I'll never forget it. And so later on that day, I went through Calvin's files just to see what made him what he was. And Calvin had committed a horrific crime. There were 3 girls, 3 co-eds from West Liberty State College. For those of you who are familiar with up north, it's in Burke County. And these 3 girls one day drove into Wheeling, which is not too far away from them, to a local laundromat to do their weekly laundry. 2 of the girls were sisters. As soon as they got there and they got their things out, one of the sisters realized she had forgot some of her laundry and went back to her dorm room, only about a 15-minute drive from the place. But while she was gone, Calvin Clements entered the laundromat. He pulled out a knife and kidnapped these two girls, put them in the back of his van, where throughout the course of a week, he would drive them throughout rural Brooke County, Ojai County, and Marshall County, where he slowly, deliberately, willfully, and brutally tortured them to death. It was a hideous crime. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences for that crime. And I'm looking at this guy and thinking, dear God, how can I love such a person? How can I love this man? And I prayed about it, and I prayed about it hard because it really bothered me. Because if I was going to call myself a disciple and have the audacity to wear that Roman collar, I had to be able to love this man. And it took me a while, but I asked those questions of myself. Would I give him a cup of water if he was thirsty? Would I give him food to eat? Would I clothe him in his nakedness? And I begrudgingly was able to answer yes to those questions. Well, I would go on back to school and finish up. In time, I would get myself ordained and end up in another parish in Wheeling, the mega parish up there that I worked for years. We had a women's Bible study. And I remember one of our first meetings, we were sitting around in a circle, about 20 women and myself, and the goal was for everyone to give their name and give a brief little bit of their personal history, their family history. And there was a woman named Sheila who spoke up. And she began to talk about her upbringing in Wheeling. She had 3 little kids, and then she began to talk about her family, and that's when she broke down and started crying. You see, Sheila was the 3rd girl that didn't get captured by Calvin Clements. She told us she had a horrible time trying to forgive this man for brutally murdering her sister. It was a miracle that Sheila was in that room that day, because if she had not forgotten her clothes and gone back to West Liberty, she would have been the 3rd victim without a doubt. And I remember that wound in my heart towards Calvin Clements got opened up all over again. I resented that man. And the more I got to know Sheila, and we're friends to this day, the more I resented and detested him. But I had to love this guy. And so I took it back to prayer again, and Sheila and I both prayed over this situation. And she is at the point now as well where she can love him in the most basic senses. Well, the Lord wasn't done knocking on my heart. There was a 3rd episode. There was a man who was an attorney in Wheeling by the name of John Bailey. He came into the church through the RCIA back in '92. And John was a very successful attorney, and one day we were hauling some equipment for the parish. He was driving, I was the passenger. And I just asked him for conversation's sake, I said, John, what's one of the most difficult cases you've ever had to take? And he said, when I was the pro bono attorney for Calvin Clements. I thought to myself, you did what? He had to represent Calvin Clements. And he looked at me and he said, quite frankly, he said, Father Jim, I know what you're thinking, but he said, you know, we have a great country. And he said, one of the things that makes our country great is that everyone is entitled to a fair trial. But you know what I was thinking? I was thinking to myself, how could you possibly defend somebody like this? This guy who did this horrible torture to these poor young girls, how could you defend him? But John told me very frankly, all people in this country are entitled to a defense. John said it was the toughest trial he had to deal with because he was thinking about his own sister, his own daughter, while he was defending this horrible criminal. But you know what? As much as we resent attorneys in doing that kind of work, at some point in time, we're going to need somebody to defend us. It's their job. It's why America is great. It's why we don't take these people as they do in China or other places and simply put them out of their misery with a gunshot to the head. We are entitled to justice. But that opened up that wound all over again. I had resentment initially towards John. I thought, how could you do such a thing? We have now become very dear friends, and a lot of you have recognized him. He comes here at our parish during Holy Week. He's now federal judge John Bailey. Well, that's not all to the story. The most recent installment happened about 2 hours ago as I was driving to St. Stephen's this morning. I just felt the need to call Judge Bailey, and I did. I called him up, and I woke him up, and I said, "What are you doing sleeping in, you big lug?" And I told him, I said, "I'm talking about you this morning." And then he got real quiet, because he didn't know what I was talking about. And I said, I told him about the Calvin Clemens story. He said, "Well, you need to tell him this about the Calvin Clemens story." Calvin Clemens got transferred from the Ohio County Jail to the state penitentiary at Moundsville, West Virginia, to serve his 2 consecutive life sentences. Just a couple of years after he was transferred to the state pen, a prison riot broke out, a very deadly prison riot. Calvin Clemens snatched 2 of the guards physically, put them in his cell, closed and locked the door, and forbade any of the other prisoners to touch them. In other words, he spared these 2 guards' lives. They both had little children. And if Calvin had not have done that, and if the other prisoners had not feared him so much, they'd be dead today. What am I saying to you? Do I love Calvin Clemens? The answer is yes. How do I love him, such a heinous criminal? I pray the following for Calvin Clemens every time I talk to Sheila. I pray that he will have the grace to repent before he takes his last breath, and I pray that our merciful God will accept his repentance and forgive him. That's about as loving as I can be towards Calvin, and you know what? That's the kind of love he needs right now. So my brothers and sisters, I will never stand up here hypocritically and tell you it's a piece of cake to love certain people. It can be difficult, not impossible, but very difficult. And as I say, there are people who will do you harm. They will do you wrong even if you love them. But as Mother Teresa of Calcutta said, love them anyway. So my brothers and sisters, that we may be identified as true disciples of the Lord, let us first pray that we will be humble in accepting this commandment of the Lord and putting it into practice by loving one another.